There is a groove in a piece of pink granite that is older than every empire you have ever studied in school, and inside that groove, under a microscope powerful enough to see individual mineral grains, someone recently found something that should not be there. Not sand. Not the green residue of a worn copper tool. Something else entirely, something so hard that jewelers cut it into rubies and sapphires. And that single discovery is why, after 40 years of being laughed out of conferences, the world's most controversial archaeological writer is suddenly being taken seriously by people who study metal for a living. Before we go further, one honest note, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves hype. What you are about to hear is not a settled scientific fact confirmed by a peer-reviewed journal. It is a claim, a genuinely fascinating one, made by writer Graham Hancock and a small team of independent researchers, and it has not yet been formally published or replicated by the wider archaeological or material science community. So treat this the way any careful person should treat a bold claim: follow the evidence, ask the hard questions, and hold your final judgment until more people have checked the work. With that said, let's look at what he's actually claiming, and why it has struck a nerve. Most people, who think about the mystery of ancient Egypt, picture the pyramids rising out of the desert, and assume that is where the puzzle lives. It mostly isn't. The bulk of the Great Pyramid is limestone, and limestone is forgiving. You can scratch it with a copper blade, break it with a chisel, and haul it up a ramp with rope and sweat and enough stubborn manpower. The scale is staggering, but the physics is not mysterious. The real puzzle, the one that has quietly bothered engineers for a century, is granite. Granite is not one soft material. It is an igneous rock built from three tough minerals fused together under unimaginable heat and pressure: quartz, feldspar, and mica. On the Mohs hardness scale, which runs from talc at 1 to diamond at 10, granite's quartz content alone sits around 7. That number matters more than it sounds like it should, because 7 is roughly where most ordinary tools simply stop working. Walk into a modern stone yard today, and watch a professional cut granite with a diamond-tipped blade spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, cooled by a constant spray of water. And it is still slow, loud, and brutal on the equipment. That is granite fighting back against 21st-century engineering. And yet, more than 4,000 years ago, in a world without electricity, without iron, without a single powered tool, someone shaped this same stone with a level of precision that still makes modern engineers uncomfortable. The king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid is built almost entirely from granite beams, some weighing more than 70 tons, fitted together with a tightness that has survived earthquakes and thousands of years of settling. Down at the Valley Temple beside the Sphinx, granite blocks are joined so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper into the seam, let alone a blade. There are granite statues with surfaces so smooth and so evenly finished that engineers who examine them tend to reach for the word machined rather than carved. And then there are the drill cores, the cylindrical plugs of stone left behind when ancient workers bored holes into granite. Some of these cores carry spiral grooves winding around their surface, the kind of mark a rotating drill leaves as it bites downward. When researchers have measured the spacing of those spirals and calculated how fast the drill must have descended to leave them, the numbers have made more than one engineer use the word industrial, not as a compliment, but as a genuine statement that the tolerances rival what factories produce today. For nearly 100 years, the textbook explanation for all of this has stayed remarkably stable. It goes like this: Egyptian workers cut granite using soft copper saws, dragged back and forth, with wet sand poured into the cut as an abrasive. The sand, not the copper, was supposedly doing the real work, its hard quartz grains grinding the granite down while the copper blade simply carried them across the surface. For rough shaping, workers pounded the stone with handheld balls of dolerite, a dense volcanic rock, blow after blow after blow. And holding the entire theory together was one final ingredient that always seems to do the heaviest lifting whenever anyone pushes back: time. Thousands of workers, generations of labor, an ocean of patient hours. It is a tidy story, And it has been repeated in classrooms and museum placards for so long that it has hardened into something that sounds like settled fact. But there is a real problem sitting at the center of it, and it is not a mystical problem, it is a material science problem. Copper sits at roughly 2.5 to 3 on the Mohs scale. Quartz, the mineral doing most of the hard work inside granite, sits at 7. That is not a close contest. When you drag something that soft across something that much harder, the soft material does not win. It wears away. Defenders of the copper and sand theory have a reasonable answer to this. The copper was never meant to cut anything on its own. It was just a carrier, a soft bed pressing loose grains of quartz sand into the stone, so the real fight was quartz against quartz, 7 against 7, which is at least fair on paper. But paper is not where this question gets settled. Decades ago, a researcher at a British university spent years actually testing this method under controlled conditions: real copper blades, real quartz sand, real granite, measuring the depth of cut, the wear on the tools, and the texture of the resulting surface. The results were sobering. The stone did yield, technically, but the progress was measured in fractions of a millimeter per hour. The copper wore away rapidly in the process, consumed by the very grit it was meant to be carrying, an expensive cost in a civilization where copper had to be mined, smelted, and traded for. And the cuts produced were rough and uneven, nothing close to the glassy, precise surfaces that survive on the real ancient granite. The pounding method fared a little better for rough shaping, but scaled up to the volume of granite inside a single chamber like the one in the Great Pyramid, the labor estimates balloon into the millions of hours. And pounding still cannot explain fine precision. Something in the standard account has always felt incomplete, and for 4 decades, one writer refused to let that incompleteness go quietly. Graham Hancock is not an archaeologist, and that fact has followed him through his entire career like a shadow. He is a journalist by training, and his broader ideas about lost civilizations and forgotten histories have made him one of the most polarizing figures in popular archaeology, embraced by millions of readers, and dismissed by a large share of academic Egyptologists. Whatever you think of his wider theories, this particular objection was never really about mysticism. It was about a saw and a stone. For years he pointed at the same gap that engineers had already noticed, the space between what copper and sand can plausibly do and what the granite actually shows, and asked what filled it. For years, the response he received was rarely about the gap itself. It was about him, not a trained archaeologist, not credentialed, not to be taken seriously. Attacking the messenger is, unfortunately, a much easier move than engaging with a hard question. What changed recently is that Hancock stopped arguing and started measuring. In collaboration with a materials scientist working in the field of tribology, the study of how surfaces were against one another, he sought access to examine the microscopic residue left inside real ancient cutting marks using tools that are common in engineering labs, but had rarely been pointed at this kind of artifact: a scanning electron microscope, capable of resolving detail far beyond what a human eye or a simple light microscope can see, paired with a technique called energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which reads the elemental makeup of whatever the beam strikes. The idea was simple. Stop debating what should be in the groove, and go look at what is actually there. According to Hancock and his collaborator, the expectation going in was completely reasonable. They expected to confirm the traditional story, to find copper residue and quartz sand embedded in the cut, closing the debate once and for all in favor of the textbook explanation. Instead, they say the wear patterns looked wrong from the start, the scratch signatures cleaner and more deliberate than anything loose sand typically carves. When they pointed the spectroscope at the residue trapped inside the grooves, they reported finding a mineral rich in aluminum and oxygen, seated deep in the cut rather than sitting loosely on the surface, which matters because a surface contaminant could simply be dust that settled there over thousands of years, while embedded residue suggests it was present while the cutting was happening. In mineral terms, that combination is corundum, the same mineral family that produces rubies and sapphires, and on the Mohs scale it sits at 9, second only to diamond itself. If that identification holds up, it changes the whole equation. Quartz against quartz is a near-even fight. Corundum against granite is not a fight at all, it is a tool against a workpiece, hard enough to bite cleanly instead of skidding across the surface. And here is the detail that makes the claim genuinely interesting rather than just convenient. Corundum does not occur naturally within Egypt in any form useful for large-scale cutting. If it really was used, it would have had to be sourced from distant deposits and brought to the quarries deliberately, which would mean the people doing this work understood mineral hardness well enough to go looking for a specific abrasive rather than simply grabbing whatever grit was underfoot. To their credit, Hancock and his collaborator did not stop at a single striking measurement and call it proof, because a residue in a groove, however dramatic, is evidence, not proof, and the two are not the same thing. Evidence tells you what might have happened. Proof requires ruling out the ordinary explanations first. Could the corundum be from a later repair, or contamination that crept in over 4,000 years, or a trace amount unrelated to cutting at all? So in the following months, the team reportedly ran a hands-on experiment, cutting granite slabs of comparable hardness using copper tools and 3 different abrasives side by side: plain sand, crushed quartz powder, and a corundum and quartz slurry. The sand behaved exactly as the earlier academic study had documented, cutting at a punishing crawl and chewing through the copper. The quartz powder did somewhat better, but still left a rough surface far from the polish seen on real ancient granite. The corundum slurry, according to their account, cut several times faster, left a noticeably smoother surface, and when used for drilling, reportedly reproduced the same spiral grooves seen on genuine ancient drill cores, a detail the copper and sand method had never managed to replicate in prior tests. When Hancock presented these findings, he reportedly took them not to an archaeology conference, but to an audience of materials scientists and engineers, people whose expertise is hardness, and where rather than Egyptological tradition. And the response there was said to be more open than the reception he has typically received from mainstream Egyptology. That contrast is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures the actual shape of this whole controversy. It is not really a fight over whether the pyramids are magical, or whether some lost supercivilization built them. It is a much narrower and more grounded question. Did the ancient Egyptians understand more about material science, trade, and abrasive engineering than they have traditionally been given credit for? That is a testable, falsifiable claim, and testable claims deserve to be tested, not dismissed because of who is asking them, or accepted just because the story is exciting. So here is where this actually leaves us, honestly. The mainstream explanation of copper tools and quartz sand has real, documented weaknesses that experiments have exposed for years, and that part is not controversial, it is measured fact. The corundum claim is a compelling, specific, and testable hypothesis that would, if independently replicated and formally published, meaningfully change how we understand ancient Egyptian technology. But if independently replicated and formally published is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and right now that step has not happened in a way the broader scientific and archaeological community has verified. Extraordinary claims deserve careful scrutiny in both directions. It is just as unscientific to dismiss a finding because the person presenting it lacks a particular credential, as it is to accept a finding because it is dramatic and satisfying. The honest position is the patient one. Watch for peer review. Watch for independent labs testing the same samples. Watch for archaeologists and material scientists actually working together instead of past each other. What this story really reveals, whether or not the corundum claim ultimately holds up, is how much of ancient technology still hides in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at old evidence through a new instrument. Millions of people have walked past these granite blocks, photographed them, measured them, and never thought to ask what was trapped inside the cut itself. So here is the question worth sitting with. If a discovery like this could be sitting unexamined in plain sight for 100 years, what else have we been looking directly at and simply failing to see? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you found this as fascinating as I did, stick around, because there is a lot more of ancient history left to question.